Why did American leaders decide that Japan's foremost naval commander must be removed, even if it meant risking scarce pilots and precious late-model fighters in the far Pacific? What made him important enough to justify the danger that Japan might realize its supposedly unbreakable naval code had been solved? The man at the center of those questions did not even begin life with the name that would later spread fear across the American fleet. He was born into the Takano family in the town of Nagoka, on the bleak northern side of Japan's main island, the last of 7 children of a schoolteacher and former samurai named Sadayoshi Takano. For more than a month, the infant went unnamed, until his father, while intent on a game of Go, snapped at his wife's nagging and told her to call the boy 56, the number of his own years. In Japanese, that sounded like Isoroku, the given name that the world would come to know. As a boy, Isoroku learned a little English and encountered Christian ideas through an American missionary named Naval. Whether that early contact softened or sharpened his later view of the United States remains uncertain. What is known is that Nagaoka's schooling prized endurance. Boys marched far in the harshest weather. Classrooms were minimally heated by low braziers. Discipline settled into the bones. One winter ritual required students to copy 100 characters on the coldest day of the year with no fire allowed. Fingers numbed to purple, the boys rubbed their hands in snow to thaw them once the task was done. In that crucible, the future admiral's stoicism took root. At 16, he set his sights on the Imperial Naval Academy at Etajima, exactly as Japan was hurrying to expand its fleet at the turn of the century. He placed near the top among hundreds of applicants and entered in the first year of the new century. The academy demanded monastic devotion. Cadets were forbidden to drink, smoke, or chase romance. Their lives were pledged to the emperor and the nation. When he graduated a few years later, war with the Russian Empire had arrived. A Japanese destroyer's surprise blow at Port Arthur signaled the new era and led to months of blockade under Admiral Heihachiro Togo. Isoroku served aboard the cruiser Nishin and saw the shock and thunder of the Battle of Tsushima firsthand. Russian ships steamed from Europe to break the blockade, only to be shattered in a single day. During the fight, a shell blast mangled his left hand and scarred his leg, taking 2 fingers and marking him for life. The loss produced a dark joke in the geisha district. A manicure for 8 fingers cost less than one for 10, and the young officer's bill was adjusted accordingly. In service, he was serious, taciturn, blunt, and keen on tactics. Off-duty, he loved cards, especially gambling games that rewarded nerve and a talent for bluff. With promotion came broader horizons. After the deaths of his parents, he was adopted into the more prosperous Yamamoto family, a common practice when an old house needed a male heir. Marriage followed to Reiko Mihashi. Soon afterward, he studied at Harvard University, focusing on economics and, crucially, petroleum. Oil, he understood, was the lifeblood of fleets, and Japan possessed little of it. That insight would color his judgments ever after. He cultivated English, sharpened his poker, and compared the logic of cards to the logic of naval war. Position, deception, reading what the opponent held but had not yet shown. Aviation caught his imagination early. Even before the end of the Great War in Europe, he predicted that the decisive ship of the future would be one that carried airplanes. He argued for carriers when the idea seemed heresy to battleship traditionalists. When critics scoffed, asking how one could sink a battleship without another battleship, he answered with torpedo-bearing aircraft and cited a proverb about a swarm of ants overcoming the fiercest serpent. Posted to Washington as a naval attaché, then to Japan's first naval air training center, he insisted on discipline among pilots and, to win their respect, learned to fly himself. He demanded better fighters and pressed industry to experiment. From such pressure would come a fast, agile shipboard fighter that the world would later fear. He traveled, observed, and bargained. He represented Japan at disarmament meetings, pushed hard against naval ratios that he considered an insult, and, when posted again to the United States and to Europe, studied the habits, budgets, and doctrines of other navies. He gained a reputation for bold thought and for an unsparing tongue. He called battleships revered scrolls that old people hang with pious faith, but that do little real work. Carriers and long-range flying boats, he said, would shape the next war. By the late 1930s, tensions sharpened. Secret planning in Tokyo had long ranked the United States as the ultimate adversary at sea, while Army officers eyed the Soviet Union on land. Yamamoto distrusted the formal chessboard assumptions of the staff colleges. He believed war with the United States would be a calamity, and he opposed an alliance with Germany and Italy that would lock Japan into enmity with the Anglo-American world. That stance earned him powerful enemies among hardline nationalists who labeled him a traitor. To get him out of politics and out of danger, superiors shifted him from the ministry back to Sea Command, first over the First Fleet, then over the Combined Fleet. If war must come, he declared, training for carrier air crews would be the first priority. Practice revealed weakness. Early bombing trials produced poor results from level runs, while dive bombers and torpedo planes showed promise. Yamamoto demanded more of everything: more training, more accuracy, more reliability. His reading and imagination pointed toward a concept that had been a speculative plot in a British writer's novel. A sudden, crushing strike at the enemy fleet at anchor, delivered by carrier planes from the open ocean. By the spring of 1941, his staff built a plan that became known as Operation Z. Yamamoto did not relish war, but he insisted that if the nation chose it, the blow must be massive and unexpected. He even threatened to resign if the plan were rejected. On the morning when war began across the dateline, Sunday in Hawaii, Monday before dawn in Tokyo, the carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched wave after wave. In little more than an hour, the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, with battleships burning in the harbor mud and airfields wrecked. American carriers were absent, and thus survived. Japan lost only a small fraction of its attacking force. Yamamoto listened to the reports aboard his flagship Nagato without outward display. Honors followed, but his private letters warned that an easy opening victory could intoxicate a nation. He told friends that the first months could bring an unbroken string of successes, yet a long war would be ruinous. The oil problem haunted his thoughts, and the embargoes imposed by the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands made the clock tick louder. The first months did bring triumphs. Singapore fell. The Netherlands' East Indies collapsed. The Philippines were pressed to the wall. Yamamoto, now master of Japan's naval destiny, argued over the next step with the desk-bound admirals in Tokyo. He had long wanted to seize Midway Atoll and push a threatening perimeter toward Hawaii. Opposition withered when a startling American raid rattled Tokyo itself. Medium land-based bombers, launched in a daring experiment from a carrier, dropped bombs that did little physical damage, but enormous psychological harm. Yamamoto, chagrined, felt compelled to finish the Midway and Aleutian operation he had already conceived, partly to prevent a repeat embarrassment, partly to draw out and crush the remaining American carriers. In the Coral Sea, soon after, the two navies fought the first battle in which opposing ships never saw one another, trading hits with carrier aircraft over the horizon. The American side lost a flat top, but bloodied a Japanese carrier as well. Yamamoto still assumed that the enemy's surviving carrier force would be too distant to interfere when his immense armada moved against Midway. He was wrong. American cryptographers had read enough of Japan's naval code to foresee the target and timing. Air crews and ships were positioned to ambush. Over 2 desperate days of early summer, American dive bombers found Nagumo's flat tops at the critical moment when decks were crowded with refueling and rearming planes. Fire blossomed, fuel burned, and 4 of Japan's elite carriers, the very ships that had led the rampage across the ocean, went to the bottom. A cruiser followed, and with those hulls vanished many of the Navy's finest pilots and deck crews, losses that Japan could not readily replace. The United States lost a single major carrier and a destroyer. The scale of defeat stunned the Japanese public. Those 4 triumphant ships had seemed invincible. Now they were gone, and with them the mystique of inevitability. Behind that catastrophe stood code-breaking, aggressive American tactics and Japanese overconfidence. The plan had been too complicated and scattered, with distant objectives in too tight a time window. Worse for Yamamoto personally, the enemy now knew enough of Japan's communications habits to anticipate movements. His own insistence on tight timetables, a hallmark of his character, would soon seal his fate. Months later, the war refocused in the central Solomon Islands. On the island of Guadalcanal, American flyers endured nightly harassment from a Japanese bomber whose mismatched engines earned the nickname Washing Machine Charlie. The larger currents of the campaign swung back and forth, but something new was brewing in the shadows. A plan to ambush the architect of Pearl Harbor himself. Intercepts revealed that the commander of the combined fleet would inspect forward bases near Bougainville on a particular morning, and would do so with the precision for which he was famous. American leaders weighed the risks. Striking him might alert Japan that its ciphers were compromised. The route would require long overwater flight at treetop height, with navigation by compass and dead reckoning alone. The interceptors would have to cross hostile skies, arrive at exactly the right minute, and escape without support. Yet the prize was tempting, and the war had grown bitter. The decision was made. A hand-picked group of twin-engined fighters would try to be at the right spot at the right time. On the eve of the mission, the chosen pilots reviewed a plan as spare and merciless as a hunting chart. 4 aircraft would serve as the elimination section, tasked with destroying the bombers carrying the visiting dignitary. The remainder would climb to provide top cover, ready to pounce on any defenders rushing up from the airfield at Kahili. Radio silence would be strict. Fuel would be stretched by carrying a single large belly tank under each plane, which meant that any tank that refused to feed would force a return. Dawn broke warm and brilliant. Engines coughed to life on the American field, and the formation rose, gathered, and leveled into a long, low arrow a few feet above the sea. The leader signaled with rudder kicks and wing wags, saving every word he could. Over glassy water, the flyers battled heat and drowsiness, each man fighting the tug of boredom and the hypnotic pattern of swells rushing beneath silver wings. The lead pilot trusted a newly installed ship's compass from a friendly Navy workshop, more than his own instrument, checked time relentlessly, and flew the first leg westward, then a calibrated turn, then another. A chain-linked geometry meant to carry them to a fixed point on the far coast at a precise minute. To the north, at Rabaul, wary subordinates pleaded with the visiting admiral to cancel the tour. He refused. Plans had been laid. Gifts and ceremonies awaited at the field, and he had promised to be punctual. Normally he wore immaculate white on such trips. That morning he chose a new dark green working uniform. 2 twin-engined bombers lifted off carrying the party, with a half-dozen fighters taking station as escort. The weather was fine, the route simple, and the schedule exact. They were due at Balale just before mid-morning, and all concerned expected a smooth inspection and a quiet return by dusk. Across the empty sea, the American formation droned on. One pilot's drop tank balked. He turned back with his wingman. The rest pressed on. At the final course change, the leader peered into sun haze and saw nothing. No coast, no islands, no checkpoints. Only a blank glare that made him think, for a shivering instant, that he had missed the entire archipelago. Then the beach appeared, exactly where his kneeboard strip map said it should be. He waggled his wings for the final tighten-up. They were 1 minute early. A voice broke radio silence. Bogies, high, 11 o'clock. 2 bombers descended against the blue with 6 escort fighters strung behind and above. The leader ordered the elimination section to their work and pushed his own throttle for a climbing parallel run, holding his cover flight for the swarm he expected to rise from the nearby airstrip. The elimination pair that should have been 4 now numbered only 2. One of the dropped tank releases had jammed, and those 2 pilots, joined wingtip to wingtip, skimmed away along the beach to wrestle with their hardware, leaving the 2 remaining hunters to close. The cover section continued to climb, disappointed not to see a furious scramble from the field. None came. What happened in the maelstrom below would be argued for years. One hunter angled across the bomber's path at treetop height, firing a sustained burst that set an inboard engine ablaze and tore at the wing. The big Mitsubishi began to trail fire and then broke apart over the jungle. Another American pressed a head-on attack that shredded the tail of a second bomber. It rolled, fell, and exploded in the trees. The sky filled with crossing tracks. Defenders dove, attackers skidded and skated between tracers, and the cover flight at last hurtled down to scatter the escorts. Those who survived would later remember streaks of black smoke rising from the green canopy and the pale shape of a single American fighter pursued low over the harbor, before it clawed for altitude and safety. On the jungle floor, at the end of a faint track through ironwood and sago palm, lay the wreckage of the first bomber. It had impacted not far from a village garden. Accounts from local islanders later spoke of a body thrown clear beneath tall trees, a sword at the hip, and a still-gloved hand. Official records from Japan would confirm the death of the commander of the combined fleet that morning. The Americans, intact enough to count one another on the trip home, did not linger. They had flown a razor's edge of fuel and luck, and daylight was running out. In the weeks and months after, arguments simmered over credit for the fatal bursts. Pilots retold the fight from their own cockpits, as pilots always will. Newspapers back home published dueling narratives. What mattered for the war, however, was settled at once. The architect of the carrier revolution, the reluctant hawk who had both warned of a long war and struck its opening blow, was gone. Japan announced his passing with solemnity, memorialized his service, and elevated a successor. But strategy is not easily replaced. Skill in deck crews and air groups could be trained, albeit slowly. The rare blend of vision and realism that Yamamoto embodied could not be regenerated on command. For the Japanese public, the shock of Midway had already rattled faith in invincibility. The loss of those 4 celebrated carriers meant more than metal and fuel. It meant the disappearance of heroic air crews who had seemed to win without effort. For American sailors and airmen, Midway had been the hinge of fortune. For both sides, the death of the admiral in the Solomons burned another lesson into the ledger. Schedules and codes can betray, and the smallest misjudgment, a timetable announced too widely, a staff officer who insists on punctuality, a tendency to underestimate the enemy's reach, can ripple outward until history itself changes course. And so the great arc of his life closes with symmetry. As a youth, he had learned endurance in unheated rooms, writing characters with numb hands. As an officer, he had taught himself to read opponents across a green baize table. As a commander, he had forced a navy to accept the airplane as its spear point. As a strategist, he had warned that victory would be fleeting if war dragged on. He gambled boldly at Pearl Harbor and won beyond any planner's expectation, only to see the house turn cold at Midway. At last, he became the hunted rather than the hunter, his own love of exact timekeeping proving the signature that allowed rivals to lay their trap. The Pacific would roar on without him through years of harsh fighting, but the shape of that struggle, aircraft-centered, intelligence-driven, decided by reach and timing, traced the very lines he had sketched. In that sense, the admiral who died in a jungle clearing remained present in every carrier deck that launched at dawn and every crew that learned to think ahead of the next wave, long after his name stopped echoing on every American's lips.